and events going on, as I discovered in trying to schedule this event. I thought Fridays were rather quiet, but apparently not. So today I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Tim Conway. He's with the IFSA-Butler University programs, and he's a director of the programs in Ireland for the IFSA-Butler. And just as in a sidebar, Ireland is the third most popular destination for study abroad for our students here at Providence College, so we send a good number. And next year, we'll be sending even more. We have about 30 students, is that right, Catherine? Who are
total in Ireland?
To Ireland?
Close to 40.
Close to 40 students that are going to study in Ireland next year, so it'll actually become our second destination. So that's just terrific. And so we're delighted that Dr. Conway could be here today along with Carolyn Watson, who is the regional representative for the IFSA-Butler programs. I want to mention also that study abroad has a great impact on our students' lives and sometimes beyond their lives here at Providence College. We have a recent alum, Shannon Brown, graduate of '09, and she actually studied in the Czech Republic, public and community service major while she was here. She's actually living in Belfast right now, and she's working with a program that's called Peace Players International. And what this is an organization that's really trying to foster, greater affiliation and cooperation among the Protestants and Catholics there in Belfast. So what they do is to bring kids from the elementary schools, from different Protestant and Catholic schools, and through basketball programs, through sports, as a way of trying to bring them together, to get to know one another, to get along, et cetera. So I think it's a wonderful thing that she's doing, that she's involved with there in Belfast. So back to Dr. Conway. This man is a very interesting person. I've just met him briefly today by looking at his CV. Served in the Royal Air Force, founded his own aerial engineering company, a historian, PhD in language and literatures. This is quite a trail, quite a fascinating journey you've been on, Tim. So we're delighted that you could be here today to really talk about some of the issues, some of the history, the background of this seemingly never-ending conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. So, Tim, thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This peace and conflict came about 2 years ago. And essentially, we started teaching it because we had students that were coming to Northern Ireland that wanted to know more about the troubles themselves, and they wanted to know the reasons, what were being done about it, for sorting the issues out, and also for how it was being done, and was there anything being done to really try and foster a relationship between the Unionist side and the Nationalists, and all of the, what I would say, the fallout parties, all of the people in Belfast. If an organization has got an I in it, it's a Republican one, and if it's got a V in it, it becomes a loyalist one. So, I mean, essentially, areas, people, organizations are easily identified by where you come from and who you associate with and where you are. Now, in most places, these areas can be quite large, but in Belfast, the majority of the conflict has been in an area of probably 2 square miles with a dividing road down the middle, and they built a wall down that road. So that, and only in Irish terms can they build a wall that's 45 feet high and call it a peace wall, where they're separating communities. But if I may, I'll start off by quoting from the INCOR statement. INCOR is actually in the University of Ulster at Magee, and Paul Arthur has been and still is involved in it, but up to recently he was heading it up. But Paul Arthur said that people in many parts of the world live among one another, despite vast differences, but it isn't always an easy road to peace and separate communities. Northern Ireland has witnessed more than its fair share of conflict, which has been symbolized by religious differences between Catholics and Protestants, but primarily occasioned by significant political and economic disparity between the two communities. However, we are lucky that today we've seen significant changes in what's been happening. And essentially, what I'm going to do now is primarily prompted by the first students that we had, and we had 16 of them, and they were on a program, and they just wanted to learn what we were doing. Now, when we started teaching the peace and conflict, we started with home rule, and then we went into 1916, and then we looked at all the incumbent troubles that happened in Ireland and the separation and partition and such like. But the question they were asked quite a lot was, but why did it get to that stage? You know, why? I mean, suddenly did you need the partition? Why was it there? And myself and another teacher we have, Dr. Eamon Phoenix, suddenly realized that we were starting at the wrong place, that we needed to look at the origins, that we needed to go way back and explain, even quite quickly, to students how the issues came about in Ireland. You know, why suddenly by 1905, 1910 was something like 95% of the land in Ireland owned by 12 to 15% of the people. And why were Ireland disenfranchised, or the Irish disenfranchised? So we started looking at the events in Ireland, and basically, I think I've got to say that the English came to Ireland, and over the space of 600 years, or perhaps slightly more, 700, almost 800 years now, they pretty much took over the country. And we can look at these English incursions, for want of a better word, as the first one, we have to say, was that the first invasion of Ireland by the English was in 1179. But they were invited. They didn't come without an invitation from Dermot MacMurrough, who was the King of Ulster. And he had a personal fight with O'Hanlon from somewhere in the Midlands and the West, and I think O'Hanlon had run off with his wife or something. So anyway, he needed help to try and get his wife back and to beat up O'Hanlon. So nobody else in Ireland would help him, so he turned to King Henry II in England, who said, well, I'm not interested, but you can ask this guy in Wales. So they sent over a man who was known in Irish as Strongbow, and Strongbow came to Ireland with 300 knights and about 2,000 men. Cut a long story short, in the space of about 5 years, he had married Dermot MacMurrough's daughter. Dermot had conveniently died, and the Normans had taken over Ireland. First English invasion, very clever, like the Normans, like they always did. Their method of becoming part of the community was just to marry the daughters of the local chiefs, and it worked extraordinarily well. In the space of 100 years, everybody was talking Irish and playing hurley and doing things, and just getting on with their lives quite nicely. I mean, various English kings tried to do things. They had statutes of Kilkenny that said that the Normans were not allowed to speak Irish or play hurling or mere native Irish games, were sort of blithely ignored, and people just got on with it. And you had suddenly huge families, the Desmonds, the Desmond Fitzgeralds down in Munster, you had the Kildare Fitzgeralds in Leinster, you had the Ormonds in the centre of the country, and in the north you had the De Burghs, the Earls of Ulster were up there. So the Normans were severely entrenched. They formed not a huge part of the country. I mean, about maybe only 2 or 3% of the population was actually Norman. They were sort of Norman Irish, whereas they became known a bit later on. They became known as the Old English, but they were very Irish in their ways, and they did things. And it really wasn't until Henry VIII was getting concerned about his accessions and such like that they actually decided that they needed to do something. So essentially, what they did was Henry VIII in about 1541 or 1541, he declared the Lordship of Ireland. where Henry was the Lord, and therefore, until that point, Ireland had just been, it was a bit like America in those days. I mean, they came to Virginia and they came to other places. But Ireland was pretty much treated like a colony, that the English were there, they were in charge, and the Irish were good for carrying wood and stoking fires and ploughing your fields and things. But when Henry VIII needed his succession, he needed to be assured, he basically made himself Lord of Ireland, and then everybody was appointed to it. And various people after Henry VIII, you had the first attempt at a colonization was really done under his daughter Mary's rule. We had a Marian plantation which was done in Leash Offaly, which they changed the name of the counties, so they became Kings and Queens County. And they attempted to actually have a plantation there. Slightly later, in 1570, we had another plantation which was going to be in Munster, and Sir Walter Raleigh is probably a name that's fairly known to all of you, and he owned significant areas of land before Queen Elizabeth chopped his head off somewhat later on. And they were the first attempts at sorting out the land, but really the Old English, the people like the Earls of Kildare and such like, were not very keen on this at all, because they saw these were sort of English newcomers. These guys came in and thought, this is where we need to take a bit of action here. These guys are old-fashioned. We need to move in here, and we can actually take this over. So essentially, that's pretty much what they did. I think it was 12,000 acres. And essentially, in total, they started off getting, that's 12,000 acres per individual. And in Munster, they took over about 300,000 acres. It wasn't terribly successful, unless it was in the lands that were really controlled by what we term in Ireland as the Desmond seniority. This was the Earl of Desmond. But eventually, towards the end of the century, poor old Desmond, for his trouble, objected to what the New English were doing, and he was caught and he was executed. So that was the end of the Desmond dynasty. And he was the 23rd Earl of Desmond. And so that earldom had lasted in Ireland from 1179 until 1580 or thereabouts, when he eventually died. At that time, most of the Irish had intermarried with the Normans, except for the set in the north of Ireland. Now, all of the coastal strips, if you look basically from where Portrush, Coleraine is, along the coast, right down as far as Belfast, had been taken over by the MacDonalds of Antrim. Now, they came over from Scotland, and they had established that. So they were there, and quite safely. And in County Down, we had Smith and Hamilton, who had taken over from Scotland under Elizabeth. So those areas were fairly well planted. And in the remainder of Ulster, it was Hugh O'Neill, who was he was the O'Neill in the Irish terms, and in the English called him the Earl of Tyrone. For those of you that are not aware of surrender and re-grant, Elizabeth and her people were very clever in the latter part of the 16th century. They said to the remaining Irish chiefs, if you surrender to me and acknowledge me as your lord, and give me your service, I will then give you an English title, and you can continue to do what you're already doing. Now, it was Hugh O'Neill, who was the Earl of Dungannon at the time, who said, how can you give me what is already mine? But, I mean, a lot of people, for the sake of an English title or an English what have you, they actually went along with it. And they gave away what they owned for the sake of getting a title, which is a bit odd, really, when you think about it. Anyway, Hugh O'Neill was an important character. He was brought up by Queen Elizabeth, and he was educated in England and all of these things. And he eventually went back to Ireland and completely changed. He became the O'Neill, and in 1594, he set up an army and pretty much took over most of Ireland. They completely, they fought the English to a standstill, but at the Battle of Kinsale in 1603, fighting with the Spanish, they were actually beaten by Bagnall and his people. So that 9 years rebellion came to an end, and all of the last Gaelic lordships, these were the northern ones, the Donegals. You had the O'Neills, you had O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, the O'Neills of Tyrone, the O'Neills of Clandyboy, and also all of the western lordships there were all beaten. And for a few years, they actually lived under a new king, because James II of Scotland, James VI of Scotland had become James I of England. And he was new. He didn't have the authority or the power that Elizabeth had, and he had a lot of people on his back looking for land. People had younger sons. America was a long way away, and that was the land where people went to get grants of land, plantations, all of this area where we are now. Everything was available, all this East Coast, but Ireland was just closer. And it was a very good place to send your second or your third son, you know, and it was a fair chance that he wouldn't die on the way home, because it's only, I mean, really, if you think about it, I mean, from the closest point from Ireland to the United Kingdom, well, it's actually Scotland, but is only about 18 kilometres, about 12 miles between the Mull of Kintyre and Fairhead. So it's not exactly a long way. And even if you left from Dublin or from County Down, you can always stop off at the Isle of Man on the way. And you can just sort of go over. So it's a close place. But it was a very odd place, because the English came over expecting to take over, but they suddenly found there was somebody else in charge. But the Irish didn't speak English. The older Irish spoke French, but by now, most of them were talking Irish. So you had a very peculiar situation where these people that looked the same as you, they dressed slightly different to you, but it was very different from arriving in a country like America, where you had the native Indians that were clearly not the same as you. But the English had a really good way of sorting this out. They just killed them. They just said, so what? And bang, you go. So, but eventually, in 1603, we had all of this happening. And in 1607, there was a decision made which was very bad for the Irish, and probably very bad for history, really, because O'Neill and O'Donnell left Ireland, and they took their families with them, and essentially that was the flight of the Earls. And that, in 1607, was probably that was the end of the Irish clan system. It was the end of, in its entirety. I mean, they were gone at that stage. I mean, we talk nowadays about Irish clans and all the rest of it, but it was finished. It was over and done with. There was no major effort to try and reinstall it at all. And what James did, and his advisors, was basically, he said, what you have done is treason. You have left your lands, therefore that is high treason, therefore your lands are forfeit. So essentially, the British, James himself, took these lands, and he took about 3 million acres. And that is a huge amount of property to take. And he also, I mean, in lands in Armagh, Tyrone, turn over one page rather than two, Coleraine, Donegal, Fermanagh, and Cavan. And actually, let me put something to bed here before we go any further. There is a big problem in Ireland. Those of you that have spent any time in Ireland, I'm sure, will be aware of this. But we have County Londonderry and we have Londonderry in Northern Ireland. And in the Republic of Ireland, it is called County Derry and Derry City. There never, ever was a County Derry. Derry was invented in the Ulster plantation. They took County Coleraine and a part of County Tyrone, and they made it into a county, and they called it County Londonderry. So, and that is what they gave to the London companies. So the London mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, the skinners, clothworkers, merchant tailors, haberdashers, salters, ironmongers, and vintners all ended up with a share of Ireland. And the deal there was, with this 3 million acres, they would sell this land off to people in large chunks, and they would be expected to come over with groups of people, with families, and really just to repopulate the country. And that's what they were there for. And that really significantly, we have the same counties now as we had in 1613. This was quite a significant act. It wasn't terribly successful. And what actually happened was there are arguments going on academically in Ireland at the moment that says significant numbers of Irish people that would have been subservient to the O'Neill or to the O'Donnell ended up far better off under the English system, because with the Irish system it was the clan chief that owned everything, and everything was a movable feast. But when the English came in, they granted people leases that gave them tenure on significant acres of land, and quite a lot of Irish actually did get tenure on their on lands, not the good land. The good land was gone, and that was gone to the English. But in this case, that was actually taken by the Irish ended up getting some form of tenure on the land that they had. So that was fine, and everything was good. Then James, he didn't last too long, and he died, and his son Charles I took over. Charles I was a pretty ineffectual king in most ways. He was very much in favor of absolute monarchy. And I suppose if you're a king, being an absolute monarch is it's not a bad thing to wish for. But England had moved on. And you had the Puritans, you had religious animosity, and Charles couldn't get the support that he needed. And so, I mean, essentially, he tried looking for support in Ireland at one stage, and eventually he led one rebellion, which he lost, and everybody thought he'd give up and let Parliament take over. But then he had a second one eventually in 1649, and then he was executed himself, which is the first case of regicide in England for a number of years. At his first, in 1641, the Irish in Ulster decided that they would take the opportunity while the British were, or the English, should I say, were involved in their own shenanigans to do with Charles and to do with Puritanism. And we had the rebellion of 1641, which was the Confederation of Kilkenny. Unfortunately, and it grieves me to say this, that was a really successful rebellion, but the Irish ended up, as we have always done, we ended up fighting ourselves. On one side, we had Owen Roe O'Neill, who was the nephew of Hugh O'Neill's, had come back from foreign service. He was working what is now Holland, but which was Flanders in those days, which was owned by Spain. So he was fighting for the King of Spain. He came back and he was probably the best soldier of his time, and he led the Irish, and he had the only significant victory in battle against the British, where he beat the Scottish General Munro at the Battle of Benburb in 1743, I think it was. And then they all went down to Kilkenny, where they all started fighting each other. Cardinal Rinuccini arrived from the Vatican as the papal nuncio, and he was fighting very much on behalf of the Vatican and the Catholic Church. And so we ended up with three major individuals. We had Owen Roe O'Neill, Rinuccini, and then we had another man called Thomas Preston, who was another soldier. And the fighting was with them. They had a deal with the English royalists. When the royalists got beaten, they then ended up fighting against the Earl of Ormond, who later became the Marquis of Ormond there, and Lord Inchiquin, who was the O'Brien. And eventually that whole thing petered out, and it lost all its impetus, and it was quite ineffectual. I'm not going to go into detail here. There are huge fingers of blame that can be pointed in several directions. But essentially, the fault is, it seems to be an Irish thing, that instead of having a leader and following him and going where it should have gone, they went against each other. Thomas Preston took over one set of battles. Owen Roe took over another set. And eventually Owen Roe died. Perhaps he was poisoned, I don't know, but he died. But to cut a long story short, I mean, the bad news was that in 1649, we ended up with Oliver Cromwell arriving in Ireland with his army. And to put not a tooth in it, in the space of 2 years, he beat everybody in sight. And he just... he had two objectives. Basically, he wanted to put Ireland firmly under English control, and to superintend all lands, all valuable agricultural land. He wanted to be controlled by his army or by English people. And these two objectives were very successful, and the result of his actions was almost 40% of the land in Ireland was redistributed from the Catholics born in Ireland to the Protestants born in Britain. So, Cromwell destroyed Drogheda, and then he later destroyed Wexford. And after that, after these two battles, he was quite brutal. He destroyed, he killed all of the officer corps, he killed all of the clergy in Drogheda, and he killed one man. He did what the Romans used to call a decimation. So 1 man in 10 was battered to death, which was a pretty grim thing to be doing. But from Cromwell's perspective, it worked. Thereafterwards, the Down survey was done, and that's where the expression came from, to hell or to Connaught. Basically, Irish landowners were given the choice: you can either stay here and die, or you can move over to the west of Ireland, because this is ours. And the Down survey reapportioned all that land to the English. Essentially, it worked extremely well. And by that stage, 75% of the land in Ireland was actually owned at that stage. So we're looking at 1652, 53, so that 75% of the land at that stage is now owned by Protestants in Ireland. To return back to England, after Charles II had died, Cromwell had taken over, and at Cromwell's death, the English invited his son Charles II back into the country. Now, Charles II just liked being a king. He had lived in France. He had been living on the subsidy provided by Louis XIV. And whilst he liked the idea of absolute monarchy and all the rest of it, it was much better to be a king in England than being at somebody else's beck and call in France. So Charles came back, minded his own business. His one unfortunate downfall was that he didn't have any children. His brother, James II, took over, and James II was a nominal Protestant, as was Charles II, by the way. But James decided, James was married to a Protestant and had two daughters, Mary and Anne, and that was fine. But then he got married again, and he then ended up having a son, which was a critical thing for the English. I mean, essentially, we have a situation in England where the aristocracy and the landowners, run Parliament, they run the House of Lords, and they're effectively running the country. And we have here that they know that if the Catholic Restoration takes place again, the Catholic Church and the Vatican has an extraordinarily long memory, and all of these landlords, all of these landowners had probably benefited quite substantially from Henry VIII's time. Now, that's only 150 years before this. So essentially they're thinking, if we have a Catholic restoration, it is not going to be terribly long before we have the Catholic Church coming back and saying, and by the way, we would like our land back, please, because it was taken then. So 95% of the aristocracy in England were really not in favour of a Catholic coming back. So when James got married for a second time and had a son, that was a disaster for them. And so the aristocrats in England invited William of Orange, who was a relatively, he was from a small establishment, and he was a very small man. He was probably under 5 feet tall, actually. And there's a statue of him in Carrickfergus that is supposed to be life-size, and he's literally that sort of size. But he was married to James's daughter, Mary. And so there was a connection there because of the marriage. Mary was a Protestant, so that was fine, as was her sister Anne. And William was a very staunch Protestant and absolutely hated Louis XIV. So William took on this, and then in a very short space of time, he had established himself in England, and then James chose Ireland as the battleground to fight for his kingdom back. So in 1688, we have James coming to Ireland, and this is the beginning of the Williamite Wars. Not to put too fine a point on it, in the space of 2 years, Derry closed its gates. The English young apprentices in Derry closed the gates on the, it was the Marquis of Antrim, as he was the second Earl of Antrim. He was leading the Jacobite forces, and they closed the gates, and that was an unsuccessful, well, it was a successful defense of a siege, but essentially when Derry was taken, then you had the Battle of Enniskillen, you had the Battle of the Boyne, which was, actually, Boyne wasn't the major battle, it's the most talked about, but the Battle of Aughrim, which happened just after the Battle of the Boyne, was the most significant one. It was at that stage that the Jacobites knew they were beaten. Patrick Sarsfield and his troops, he had about 13 or 14,000 troops, went to Limerick, and they defended Limerick against William and against General Ginkle. And in 1691, they actually had an honourable surrender, and they were allowed to leave Ireland with, they had their banners and their swords were armed. And the Treaty of Limerick was actually a significant treaty, which was negotiated by Patrick Sarsfield. And that actually allowed Catholics to maintain their arms. It allowed Catholics to live in Ireland and to maintain establishments. But again, as soon as they had surrendered. And Sarsfield and his troops, about 8,000 of them actually elected to go to France. The King of France, Louis XIV, had offered them a place in France in his army, and they went, and that was the beginning of the wild geese, that emigration to France. And so we ended up with the Williamite Wars, where we had a complete success on the Protestants. At the end of that particular time, we have what we term the long 18th century. So from 1691-92, going right through until the 1798 rebellion. We have a very quiet time in Ireland, but this is when Dublin is built as a city. This is when Georgian Dublin was formed. And any Jacobite things that happened, there was a Jacobite rebellion in 1715 in Scotland, which was a failure. There was another Jacobite rebellion in 1745-46, which is another failure. And essentially, it was really in the mid-1700s, England fought France for control, really, of what was the trade world. So it beat the French, England beat the French in India, and it essentially beat the French here, and had this. And then England's only drawback in the 18th century was this place. It actually lost America. And that was lost by complete stupidity on the part of George III. But it was done. Then we had the 1798 rebellion, and that, in fact, was led by primarily the originators of 1798 were the Presbyterians and the dissenters in Northern Ireland. In the intervening years, we had seen significant acts of government brought in to stop to prevent the original act was brought in to prevent dissenters taking over the running of towns and bodies. So you had the Test and Corporations Act, which essentially were based on religious grounds that said that you must take communion under the auspices of the Church of England or Church of Ireland, or else you may not become a servant. So this was applied in several ways. And the penal laws were literally, I mean, it prevented Irish youthful people from learning. They were not allowed secondary or tertiary education. It prevented Irish Catholics from becoming lawyers, from joining the army, from joining the government service. So there was nothing left to them except trade. So they started to trade, and they traded with France, and they did things. So the connection in France grows. And if you actually look at France today, you will see, I mean, vast amounts of the wine industry in Bordeaux have Irish names, and the connections in Galway with Spain were quite significant as well. But essentially, the Irish Catholics stayed quiet, minded their own business, and in 1798, when the rebellion arose, they got another severe hiding there, unfortunately. And they lost pretty much everything they had at Wexford. And it was really only... the Catholics were doing all right until then, because with the help, because they hadn't got involved in the Scottish rebellions in 1745, they needed soldiers to fight here in America. So Irish soldiers had come over here to fight for George III, because he wouldn't let his Hanoverians leave England because he was afraid. So essentially the Irish had got, most of the penal laws were 1782, 1793, they were pretty much gone. And the Catholics were in a pretty good position. And if anything, the 1798 rebellion really reversed their situation, because it's my belief that if things have maintained, we would never have seen an Act of Union. And the Act of Union was where the Irish Parliament that had actually made its own rules was closed, and it was amalgamated with the Parliament in England. That had two dramatic effects. It meant that the Irish could no longer generate its own laws, and it also meant that Dublin as a city had lost literally all its political importance. So all of the areas that are in Dublin today, Leinster House, Merrion Square, where our office is, I mean, all around that area that had survived on the winter business of the Parliament had suddenly just stopped. What was the Irish Houses of Parliament was left idle, and it still is the Bank of Ireland building today. So you had Dublin really lessening itself as an important place. And again, by that time, they estimated by 1776 that 5% of the land in Ireland, only 5% was actually owned by Catholics. The remaining 95% was owned by a very small 12 to 15% of the population. Was virtually all Protestant owned 95% of the land. Things moved on and things changed slightly. George III reneged on his promise to give Catholic emancipation with the Act of Union. Basically, in January the 1st, 1801, the two parliaments became one. Everything moved to England, everything's gone, and then we have a fight for Catholic emancipation, which came about in 1829. The next battle is for Home Rule, is to get the Parliament back. But in that meantime, we lost a huge amount with the potato famine in 1841. The 4 or 5 famines that really came about from 41 to 49 decimated the population of Ireland. The population went down from somewhere near 8.2 million down to somewhere like 3.5. I mean, mainly there was a huge amount of emigration to America and to other places. A lot of people died, lots of people went to England. And then we had the Irish Parliamentary Party. So that for Charles Stewart Parnell, that was very successful. Then Parnell, with his little marital mishap, he convented, and then we had Redmond and the party, and eventually Ireland got some leverage because the Act of Union gave Ireland 100 seats in the British Parliament. And with that 100 seats, it gave Ireland, they could move their vote to suit whoever. And basically, they really went for the Home Rule thing. And eventually, after 3 attempts, the third Home Rule Bill passed, and that passed in 1914, in 1912, should I say. But before it could be implemented, the First World War had broken out, and it was put into abeyance, and then we ended up in 1916. And 1916 is where we begin to actually teach our peace and conflict. Because, well, 1912 is really where we do it, because that Act of Covenant that was there, that really formulated the Ulster Unionists coming together and forming themselves as a general body. But essentially, I've probably gone on long enough at this stage. So we start our peace and conflict at 1900, basically 1905 or thereabouts, and we take it through to the next century. But I haven't got another hour to tell you how we do that. So thank you very much indeed. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
If you could, Tim, I'm just curious as how you would describe things at the present moment.
Currently, things, I personally believe, are excellent. We have a government that works. The most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life was Ian Paisley sitting down, chuckling with Martin McGuinness. I mean, they're just laughing and having a good time, and they actually became in the British press. They were known as the Chuckle Brothers, which was really, I mean, it was quite amazing. And I don't know what happened to the man, but something happened to Paisley. I absolutely guarantee that something happened to him. But again, and you have a hardline IRA person, whatever he says, but Martin McGuinness was hardline, he was IRA, and these two guys got on like a house on fire. And it's amazing. I mean, there has been a tectonic shift in Ireland. And these guys, they have political differences, but they work together. I mean, the Ulster Unionists are now seen as the people who are intransigent and not willing to move. And the DUP, that was supposed to be the ultra-right party, are the people that are actually doing things. There will be an election in May. I am sorry that we are not, this semester we aren't teaching a peace and conflict program, but I'm really sorry we aren't doing it this year, because it would have been an excellent place to put people in this May. So in a couple of months' time, if you're going to Ireland, there's going to be an election in the north, and that's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of it, but Robinson, who is the leader of the DUP now, his wife was caught having an affair with a 22-year-old guy, and they've been giving him money and doing things. I don't know if that was really announced over here. But he's even survived that. You know, and he's still in power, and it's amazing that they are working things together. I think Northern Ireland has a real possibility. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that when the Good Friday Agreement was put together in 1998, there's two significant conditions. And one of them was that the Irish Republic got rid of Articles 4 and 5 in its constitution, which gave it a claim to 32 counties in Ireland. So they got rid of that. And they are saying that the only time that they will ever make a claim on a united Ireland is if there is a referendum and more than 50% of the people in Northern Ireland ever want a united Ireland. They haven't given up on it, but they've laid aside their claim. And in the British and the Northern Irish, in their turn, gave their significant thing was that they have agreed that people can now, anybody born in Northern Ireland is entitled to be a citizen of both countries. So you can be a British citizen and you can be an Irish citizen. And so we have a united Ireland, but we don't. But anybody that wants to be Irish is and can be Irish. And I think that they're the significant things, because they are what they always wanted to be. And there's a significant working ethos between the two governments, and I'm talking about the government of Northern Ireland and the government of the Republic of Ireland. And everybody is in and out of there like a fiddler's elbow, and they're just around all the time. And people are now, I mean, it is quite common to see a picture in a paper or to even see them on the street. And, you know, Ireland's a pretty small place. How many people are there? What's the population of Rhode Island? Does anybody know?
Just over 1 million.
1 million. But I mean, you're the smallest state in USA, aren't you? Well, what? I mean, I just read that somewhere recently. But basically, we've only got 4.5 million in the whole country, and you know, we're trying to be sort of international movers and shakers, which makes me smile, really. But it's working, you know. Yes.
Politically, it sounds like there's more, I wouldn't say unification, but people working together better than they have in quite a long time. How is it at the population level? Are the population's relationships better?
They're better, but I mean, the large problem, and this is something that we try and address in a very small way in the Peace and Conflict program, the majority of people involved in the violence were they were the very working class areas of town. They were very poor, they had very dependent jobs that were dependent on other people. And most of these are now coming round to significantly important events, that education is important. And you will find that the Catholic community is far more interested in getting its children educated. I mean, if you look at the people that have come out, I mean, a significant thing was the 1944 British Education Act that was implemented in Northern Ireland in 1947. And that allowed for examinations at 11 years old, the 11 plus exam, and the formation of grammar schools. And again, at grammar schools, if you got your A-level results and they were sufficiently good, you got a grant and you went to universities. And that started in 47, and the Catholic community have supported that right through the system and still do. So if you look at universities now like Queen's, Queen's is about 61, 62% Catholic now, which is quite significant. But the Protestant population, the working class Protestant population, has never embraced education in the fashion that the Catholic community has. Even when you had prisoners who were guys in the IRA and they were in prison for doing things, the biggest spend from the government on the Irish, on, say, IRA prisoners, for want of a better word, was actually on educational means. Well, it was something, I mean, there is a joke in Northern Ireland, which I don't necessarily subscribe to. It says in the Protestant and the Loyalist things in prison, the biggest expense was actually for weightlifting equipment, but I'm not sure about that. But yes, it's true. But again, it is all about education, and it's about, and what we do in our program for peace and conflict is we put American students into the poorer areas, into elementary schools, and we start talking to the youngsters, the 6, 7, 8-year-olds, and asking what their opinions are about things and seeing how we can help. Yes?
How's the integration of sensitive institutions such as the police?
That it was in the beginning, but again, that's worked perfectly. It isn't 50% yet, but it's in the high 30s. It's 37 or 38%, and the police force just works. The police force is just getting on with its job, and the police commission is just across from our Belfast office, and that works perfectly. Now there is some dissent. I mean, but we had terrorism was a job for such a long time, and the retirement things weren't great in it. So essentially, you've still got some people that, you know, they feel that they haven't benefited from it, and they still want something. So you have sort of, my Irish isn't great, but I mean, you know, they are still looking for things. But most people are just saying enough. But I mean, it is, you've got these distant IRA groups. Nobody knows quite what they want, but they're still around. And I personally think it's just like a wish of, you know, they just want something to do. Okay.
The Good Friday Agreement comes sort of on the wave of the Latin American organization, the South African Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but it's a very different process. And I'm wondering, in the broader geography of transitional justice, where is it that Ireland stands in terms of providing an example to all these countries that are trying to overcome their internal divisions and embrace human rights?
I think we're an example. I mean, I think we've achieved it.
Specifically, for whom do you think you are going to be serving as an example?
I don't know that anybody ever had a problem that's quite like ours. I mean, our problem was, it was interesting. I mean, it was, you have communities and people that are exactly the same. And don't forget, the average person going out there and doing all of this violence is only nominally a Catholic, and they're only nominally a Protestant. They don't go near churches, these people. But they call themselves this. And yeah, it's politically driven, a lot of it. I mean, there is a lot of blame to be placed on people like James Craig. I mean, that incredibly crass remark that he made in 1930, who said about the Ulster Parliament, you know, this is a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. You know, those kind of intransigent, you know, but those kind of people are gone. I mean, they may be there, but most of them have moved off to England. If you don't like the way things are happening in Ireland, go. You want to be British, it's over there. But that's happening. But I think we're an example to people. I mean, we really try hard, you know, and people do get on. Okay.
Thank you all again for coming also. It's been a pleasure having you here today, and we'll have a chance to meet with our students this afternoon.
Okay,
All
love
right.
to.